The sickeningly sweet scent of myrrh and crushed aloes failed entirely to mask the truth of the fourth day. It was the smell of finality, thick and oily, clinging to the dry air of Bethany, and it had become the permanent wallpaper of my soul. I stood slightly apart from the mourners, leaning against the sun-baked mud wall of Lazarus's house, feeling the physical weight of my failure pressing down on me like the oppressive midday heat. Lazarus was my friend, my brother in trade. We cut stone together, shaped the foundations of half the houses in this village, and yet when the fever took him, I could do nothing but watch. I had argued with Martha and Mary, pleaded with them to send the fastest runner immediately to Perea, where the Nazarene teacher, Jesus, was reportedly speaking, but they were hesitant, citing the dangers of the journey, the political tensions, and perhaps a subtle pride that Lazarus could recover on his own. By the time the message was finally sent, the fever had won. Now, for days later, the waiting had resolved into an agonizing, irreversible certainty. Hope, that cruelest of human inventions, had departed, leaving only a desiccated, hollow shell of guilt in its place. I wasn't just grieving Lazarus. I was grieving the crushing realization that there are some things, some failures, that even the most powerful faith or deepest love cannot reverse. This was not a sickness that could be healed. This was death, the ultimate, unchallengeable boundary. And the worst despair is not the loss itself, but the knowledge that you had the chance to fight it and waited too long. I looked at the dark maw of the tomb's entrance, visible just up the sloping hillside, a perfect, hand-carved cavity in the limestone. A cavity I had helped dig years ago. We had dug it for Lazarus's father, never imagining it would hold him so soon. I knew the dimensions of that tomb better than anyone. I knew the stone we had rolled across the entrance was heavy, flawless, and sealing shut a reality that no prayer, no promise could undo. Martha, always the pragmatist, now looked haggard, her customary efficiency shattered by sorrow. Mary, usually soft-spoken and serene, sat silently, her face a mask of stone, radiating a grief so profound it seemed to pull the light out of the courtyard. They still spoke of Jesus, murmuring about his coming, but even their voices lacked conviction. For days, that word echoed in my chest like a death knell. In our climate, for days meant decomposition had irrevocably begun. It meant decay had claimed its stake. No healer, no matter how powerful his reputation, could possibly challenge a claim staked so firmly by the earth. I scoffed internally at the idea that they still held onto some sliver of expectation. It felt disrespectful to Lazarus, whose body was now irrevocably changed, to hold onto such a flimsy, outdated hope. Despair, for me, was a rational response to an absolute fact. I had tested hope, and hope had failed. Now, all that remained was the hard, cold comfort of knowing the worst had happened, and nothing could change it. The hours crawled by, marked only by the shifting shadows of the olive trees and the low, droning lamentations of the hired mourners. These professional criers, with their practiced, high-pitched wails, usually grated on my nerves, but today, they simply added to the atmosphere of oppressive futility. I watched Martha pace the courtyard entrance, her eyes constantly scanning the road from Jerusalem. Her restlessness was infectious, stirring the pot of anxiety and resentment that had been simmering within me since the fever first broke. I wanted to scream at her, tell her to stop looking, to accept the finality, because every time she looked toward that empty road, she momentarily rekindled a spark of hope that I knew, with chilling certainty, would only result in a greater, more devastating disappointment. It was easier, safer, to live in absolute despair than to risk another wave of soul-crushing loss. My trade, the working of stone, requires respect for permanence and weight. Stone does not change its nature. It is reliable. Life, faith, and hope, however, were proving to be infinitely malleable, unreliable, and ultimately treacherous. I found myself running my hands over the rough texture of the wall, seeking the reassuring stability of the inorganic material. That stability was all I had left. When Martha finally paused her pacing and collapsed onto a low bench, covering her face with her hands, I felt a perverse sense of relief. At last, even she was submitting to the inevitable gravity of the situation. We were truly alone, abandoned by fate and by the one man they had trusted to save them. The political climate surrounding this Jesus only deepened my cynicism. I had heard the whispers in the marketplace, the talk of blasphemy, the threats from the temple authorities. Even if he had arrived earlier, what good would it have done? He would have faced the power of Roman law and the rigid doctrines of the Pharisees. He could challenge sickness, perhaps, but could he challenge the entire established order that decreed certain things must be, and that death was the final, unchallengeable authority? My despair wasn't just grief. It was also a deep-seated distrust of any promise that sought to transcend the visible, verifiable constraints of this world. The stories of his miracles felt distant, abstract, like brightly colored tapestries that had no bearing on the gray, dusty reality of Lazarus's sealed tomb. I kept replaying the last moments. Lazarus struggling for breath, the sweat on his brow, the terrible rattle in his chest. No amount of future intervention could erase the agonizing, mundane reality of that death. It was this memory, the tangible, undeniable reality of his last breath, that cemented my despair. And as the afternoon shadows lengthened, casting long, skeletal fingers across the silent courtyard, I found myself wishing for Jesus not to come. His late arrival would only serve as a theatrical reminder that his power, whatever its extent, had a limit, a deadline that had already passed, cementing the fact that some disasters are simply too far gone to fix. The news of his arrival did not come in a triumphant fanfare, but in a ragged whisper that rippled through the small group of mourners. Martha, galvanized by the rumor, sprang up, the weariness momentarily banished from her eyes. She did not wait for him to reach the house, but flew down the narrow path that led out of the village, her dark robes flapping behind her. I watched her go, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I knew what she was going to say, what she had to say, because it was the truth that haunted all of us. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It was the great, echoing, if that defined our week of anguish. When Martha returned, she brought Jesus with her, along with a small cluster of his disciples, looking travel-worn and somewhat wary. The moment Jesus stepped into the shadow of the house, the atmosphere shifted instantly. It wasn't just his presence. It was the intense, focused stillness he carried, a quality that seemed both completely calm and immensely powerful. He looked directly at Mary, who had been summoned by Martha, and the sight of her deep, unshakable sorrow finally broke the composure he had maintained. Mary approached him, not with the energy of Martha, but collapsing at his feet, repeating the exact same words, laced with an even deeper anguish. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Their shared statement was an accusation wrapped in a plea, a declaration that faith, in this instance, had been brutally betrayed by timing. My internal cynicism flared. Of course, they blamed the delay. If the supposed healer had been present, and the death still occurred, then the blame would shift to the inadequacy of the miracle worker. This way, the integrity of his power remained theoretically intact, while the reality of our loss remained absolute. It was a neat theological trick, but it did nothing to bring Lazarus back. Jesus did not offer any grand pronouncements or excuses. He simply asked, with a gentle sadness that was entirely unexpected, "Where have you laid him?" His voice was low, yet it cut through the murmuring crowd. His question, however mundane, was the true spark that ignited a fresh wave of skepticism in me. Did he truly not know? Was this a performance of ignorance? Or was he genuinely grappling with the overwhelming finality of what he faced? I watched as a deep shadow of emotion crossed his face. He saw the weeping of Mary, the shattered dignity of Martha, and the collective, hopeless grief of the onlookers, including the Jerusalem Jews who had come to mourn. And then he did the most astonishing and confusing thing. Jesus wept. He didn't just shed a tear. His body language conveyed a sorrow that was raw, empathetic, and profound. But this weeping didn't soothe my despair. It exacerbated it. I thought, he weeps because he knows he is too late. He weeps because he has met his limit. He weeps because he knows that even his greatest power cannot undo 4 days of rot. For me, his tears were a confirmation of the absolute dominion of death, a shared grief between a powerless man and a grieving family. I saw no divinity in that moment, only the universal, devastating pain of loss, confirming that we were all, even this reputed Son of God, ultimately subject to the same crushing realities. The small procession began to move toward the tomb, winding up the sun-drenched, dusty slope. The crowd, which had swelled with the arrival of Jesus, followed, a confused, murmuring current of pity and intense curiosity. My steps were heavy, weighted by the sense of going to witness not a miracle, but a final, dramatic failure. I kept my distance, walking alongside a group of men from Jerusalem who had come to mourn. They were whispering among themselves, their voices low and critical. Could not this man, who opened the eyes of the blind, have kept this man from dying? One scoffed, loud enough for me to hear. Their cynicism was familiar and oddly comforting. It validated my own rational despair. As a stonemason, the tomb was my territory, my silent testament to craftsmanship and finality. I knew exactly where it was situated, a perfect cut in the rock face, about 20 paces up from the path. The entrance was secured by a heavy, discus-shaped stone, designed to roll into a deep groove, sealing the cavity shut with a definitive, irreversible thud. I remembered how much effort it took, even with 3 strong men, to roll that stone into place. It was not meant to be moved lightly. It was built for eternity. When we reached the crest of the small hill, the stone face loomed ahead. The air here felt thicker, hotter, and the mixture of myrrh and decay was sharper. Jesus stood before the sealed entrance, his form radiating an intense concentration that seemed to silence the entire assembly. He looked at the stone, this ultimate symbol of human mortality and geological permanence, and his next words were simple, yet seismic in their implication. Take away the stone. The command hit me like a physical blow. It was absurd. It was meaningless. Why disturb the dead? Why open the chamber of corruption and sorrow just to look upon the irreversible evidence of failure? My heart pounded, a chaotic drumbeat against the silence. It was Martha who reacted immediately, stepping forward, her face blanching, the practical woman momentarily regaining control over the grieving sister. Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Her words were a desperate appeal to reason, a horrified acknowledgement of the physical reality hidden behind the rock. She knew the irreversible biology of the matter. For days meant the body was already dissolving back into the earth, claimed entirely by natural processes. To open that tomb now was to subject everyone to a gruesome reality, to shatter the last vestiges of dignity the family held. But Jesus merely looked at her, his eyes steady, penetrating her deep grief and deeper doubt. Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a final, quiet invitation past the edge of reason. I watched, trapped by fascination and horror, as 2 of his disciples and several village men approached the immense circular seal. The stone was cold, dense, and absolute. It was the only thing standing between the mourners and the unspeakable reality of absolute decay. My mind, trained in weights, levers, and the unyielding laws of physics, screamed that this entire endeavor was a futile exercise in theatrical tragedy, a final, cruel demonstration that sometimes, even the most profound spiritual power must concede defeat to the simple, brute force of time and gravity. The men strained against the monumental stone, their muscles bulging beneath the linen tunics. The stone groaned, scraping loudly against the dust-filled groove, announcing its surrender with a sound like grinding teeth. As the final gap opened, releasing the pent-up air from the chamber, the collective gasp of the crowd was not one of awe, but of instinctive, visceral revulsion. Martha was right. The stench was immediate, overwhelming, and utterly unmistakable. The heavy, sweet, acrid odor of biological decomposition. A smell that assaults the mind more than the nose, confirming death's sovereignty with brutal sensory proof. Many people instinctively recoiled, covering their mouths and noses with their robes. I, too, had to fight the urge to step back, but a morbid, desperate curiosity rooted me to the spot. This was the moment of truth, the point where all grand claims meet the irreducible reality of rot. I felt a bleak satisfaction. This stench was my proof. It was the absolute counter-argument to any notion of reversal. It proved the finality I had accepted days ago. Jesus did not flinch, did not cover his face, but stood immediately before the gaping black entrance, breathing in the polluted air that symbolized the end of all earthly hope. He looked into the darkness, and then he did something that confused my cynical, rational mind more than his tears had. He didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't even immediately call out to Lazarus. Instead, he looked upward, raising his eyes and his hands toward the sky, and began to pray aloud. It wasn't a desperate plea for power or a secret incantation. It was a formal, public address, filled with astonishing confidence. Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. The prayer was not about asking for a miracle, but declaring that the miracle was already granted, already a settled reality in the spiritual realm. This realization hit me with unexpected force. Was this performance? Or was this a terrifying, profound certainty? The sheer audacity of thanking God for an accomplished act before the act had even manifested was dizzying. If I were standing there, knowing the smell of decay filled the air, the unyielding stone was moved, and the reality of 4 days had passed, I would have questioned everything. Would I believe the impossible command? Or would my own pain and rational knowledge paralyze me? Where does rational doubt end and true despair begin? This, I realized, was the test. It wasn't a test of Lazarus's body, but a test of our capacity to believe in an intervention that violates every known law of the universe, right when the evidence against it is most pungent and absolute. The crowd was utterly silent now, captivated by the terrifying tension of the moment, hovering between the evidence of their senses and the immense, focused authority radiating from the man before the tomb. The stench, the proof of death, had never been stronger, yet Jesus stood there, poised, thanking God for the triumph he was about to command. My despair, which had been a sturdy, rational fortress, suddenly felt exposed, facing a power that acknowledged the reality of the grave but claimed jurisdiction over it anyway. The finality I trusted was being challenged not by wishful thinking, but by a declaration of divine right. The prayer ended, and the silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with expectation and horror. It stretched out, taut as a bowstring, seeming to halt the very passage of time. Jesus took a deep breath, perhaps inhaling the very decay that mocked his presence. And then, his voice erupted. It was not loud, not shouted, but it possessed an inescapable resonance, cutting through the thick, midday air and penetrating the silent depth of the grave. It was a command delivered with the simple, undisputed authority of creation itself. Lazarus, come forth. The words were absolute. No modifiers, no conditions, no hesitation. They were not a request to the Father, nor an appeal to the heavens, but a direct, powerful, personal command addressed to a dead man. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced that the next sound would be silence, or perhaps the rustling wind, confirming the pathetic failure of this highly dramatic gesture. But then an impossibility occurred. From the utter darkness of the cave, a sound emerged. It was subtle at first, a low, scraping friction, followed by a soft, muffled thud. It was the sound of something shifting, something moving within the chamber of the dead. Every person present leaned forward involuntarily, straining to understand what they heard. The scraping grew louder, a distinct, rhythmic shuffle, like feet dragging heavily across the dusty stone floor, punctuated by the rustle of linen. It was the sound of a bound body attempting locomotion. Time seemed to stop entirely. The smell of decay was still there, but it was momentarily eclipsed by the sheer terror and disbelief. Then, emerging from the black mouth of the cave, waddling awkwardly in the dim light, was a figure. It was Lazarus. He was swathed from head to foot in the burial cloths, the white linen strips wound tightly around him like a heavy cocoon, leaving only a small gap for his eyes and nose, which were slightly visible, wide and blinking in the unaccustomed sunlight. He looked like a statue that had decided, mid-sculpting, to take a clumsy walk. The transformation of the crowd was instantaneous and chaotic. The sound was not a unified cheer, but a cacophony of shrieks, gasps, and unintelligible cries. Some people fell backward in sheer terror, convinced they were witnessing a ghoul or an illusion. Others dropped immediately to their knees, their faces pressed against the dust, overwhelmed by the manifestation of divine power. I did not move. I could not move. My brain, meticulously trained to accept only the permanent laws of physics, had no category for this sight. Lazarus, the man whose decay I could smell, whose death I had witnessed, whose tomb I had helped seal, was standing before me, moving, breathing. The certainty of my despair, the rock-solid foundation upon which I had built my acceptance of failure, was dissolving into a vapor of impossible light. This wasn't merely a healing. This was a reversal of creation's most fundamental law. It was the undoing of 4 days of absolute decomposition, a direct challenge to the authority of the grave. My cynicism was not merely refuted. It was incinerated by the simple, clumsy presence of my friend, bound yet standing, alive yet reeking faintly of the underworld. The sight of Lazarus, bound and shuffling, was simultaneously the most wonderful and most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. He was alive, breathing, and awkwardly present, yet still trapped by the symbols of his recent death. Martha, who had been frozen in horror, was the first to rush forward, only to stop short, unsure how to approach the reanimated figure. Mary remained on her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Not tears of sorrow now, but of pure, overflowing shock and elation. Jesus, however, remained utterly calm amidst the chaos he had wrought. He looked at the bound man and delivered the second, equally simple command, addressing not Lazarus, but the stunned onlookers. Unbind him and let him go. This command, too, carried a profound secondary meaning. Lazarus had been called forth from the prison of death, but he still needed the community to fully release him from the physical remnants of the tomb. He was free, but still wrapped in the past. I finally found my feet, the paralyzing terror giving way to a surging, primal joy that eclipsed 4 days of absolute gloom. I rushed toward him, followed by Martha and several strong men, eager to obey the command and touch the living proof of the miracle. The linen was tightly wound, heavy with oils and spices, a stiff casing that had kept the body preserved and now kept the man constrained. As we frantically pulled the strips away, the smell of myrrh and aloes, mixed with the faint, lingering odor of the grave, became overwhelming. The process of unbinding him was symbolic. Every strip we removed was a shedding of the absolute despair that had gripped us all. When the final strip fell away, Lazarus stood nakedly before us, blinking, his skin pale but clearly living, breathing normally. He was confused, disoriented, but undeniably Lazarus. I threw my arms around him, gripping his shoulders, needing the physical confirmation of his warmth, his solidity, the reality of his heartbeat. The tears that finally came were not sorrowful, but cleansing, washing away the bitter residue of hopelessness I had carried. My entire philosophy of permanence and rationality was shattered. I, the stonemason who trusted only in the unyielding laws of the material world, was holding a man who had transgressed those laws entirely. My despair had been founded on the belief that some endings are absolute and irreversible. Lazarus's resurrection proved that there is a power that operates entirely outside the jurisdiction of human failure, time, and decay. The cure for my despair was not a slow, logical argument, but a sudden, violent intrusion of the divine into the mundane reality of the tomb. It was an overwhelming, undeniable fact that death, the anchor of all my cynicism, was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience for this man, Jesus. The crowds, now fully recovered from their initial shock, erupted in an incredible clamor of praise and worship, surrounding Jesus and Lazarus, desperate to touch them, to see the man who had been dead and was now undeniably alive. The remainder of the day was a blur of chaotic celebration, profound reverence, and simmering political tension. Lazarus was ushered back into his house, quickly attended to, fed, and surrounded by neighbors and family who kept touching him, checking his pulse, whispering in awe. I stayed close, observing the simple, beautiful fact of his ordinary existence. The way he drank water, the way he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, the utterly mundane actions that now felt like the most profound of miracles. The despair that had choked my spirit for 4 days was entirely gone, not replaced by cautious hope, but by radical, unshakable certainty. I had seen the limit of the grave broken, and once you witness that, the world's other problems shrink dramatically. But the miracle was not received universally. I noticed the Jerusalem visitors, the ones who had whispered their skepticism, had quietly slipped away, their curiosity replaced by fear and a clear, focused hostility. They had not witnessed a sign of God. They had witnessed a threat to their established order, a violation of the quiet agreement they had made with the permanence of death. They went straight to the Pharisees, the leaders, and reported everything. The air of celebration was therefore mixed with a chilling anticipation of reprisal. This was not a secret healing. It was a public declaration of sovereignty over life and death, and such a declaration could not go unchallenged by those who held earthly power. As the initial shock subsided, a new, deeper reflection began to take root in my heart. Why had Jesus waited 4 days? He had been delayed deliberately, knowing Lazarus was dying. If he had come on the first or second day, the miracle would have been simply a powerful healing, impressive but perhaps attributable to some natural vitality or mistaken diagnosis. People would have said, he was only sleeping. But by waiting until the 4th day, until decomposition was undeniable, until the scientific and spiritual certainty of death was absolute, Jesus ensured that the miracle was not merely great, but categorically impossible. He waited until all natural hope was exhausted, until Martha, Mary, and especially I, the hardened skeptic, were submerged in the deepest, most rational despair. He didn't just cure Lazarus's body. He cured our collective hopelessness. He cured the fundamental fear that our losses are final, our failures irreversible, and that the grave holds the ultimate authority. I realized that my despair was a form of self-imposed imprisonment, a surrender to the visible constraints of the world. Jesus tested the limits of the grave not just to prove his power, but to shatter the very structure of our grief. He delayed so that the glory would be maximized, so that the proof would be incontestable, and so that the resultant faith would be forged in the fire of utter despair. I now understood that the true, agonizing battle in life is often fought not against external tragedy, but against the crushing internal weight of believing that nothing can ever change, that the stone will never roll away. My conversations with Lazarus in the days that followed were surprisingly ordinary, yet infused with an extraordinary weight. He remembered the fever, the darkness, the peace, and then the sudden, sharp, demanding voice calling him back. He described the utter astonishment of being a part of the earth one moment, and then being violently reclaimed by life the next. He wasn't a phantom or a half-dead specter. He was whole, healthy, and profoundly confused about the fuss, though deeply loving toward his sisters and the teacher who had shattered the certainty of his rest. I spent those hours helping him repair some damage to his courtyard, the small, mundane acts of a mason, and found myself analyzing every stone, every joint, every grain of dust, searching for a physical explanation, a rational loophole in the universe that could explain what I had seen. But there was none. The evidence was simply Lazarus's heartbeat and the discarded strips of linen, still faintly smelling of myrrh and the tomb. My training, my entire life devoted to the material world, now informed a new, radical truth. If the material world can be overturned by a spoken command, then what limits remain? What despair is truly final? This perspective shift was the essence of my personal cure. My despair wasn't just about Lazarus. It was about the fear of the void, the terror that everything beautiful and meaningful ultimately succumbs to entropy and silence. Lazarus, sitting across from me, sharing a meal, proved that silence is not the final word. The magnitude of this realization extended far beyond Bethany. I began to see the small, everyday struggles of the people around me. The farmer worrying about drought, the merchant fearing bankruptcy, the child grieving a lost toy, not as trivial, but as smaller reflections of the ultimate despair. the fear of irreversible loss. And I knew the answer was always the same. If the ultimate loss can be reversed, then all lesser losses hold the potential for redemption. I reflected on the irony. My despair was cured not by the promise of heaven, but by the tangible, physical reality of a resurrection here on the dust of the earth, proving that God's power is not confined to the distant afterlife but can intrude violently and beautifully into the worst moments of our earthly failure. The physical presence of Lazarus became a beacon, a constant reminder that the impossible is merely the space where human limits end and divine authority begins. I realized that Jesus had not performed the miracle for Lazarus, who was already at peace, but for us, the living, the hopeless, who were trapped in the bondage of our grief and despair. The unbinding of Lazarus was our unbinding, a release from the shroud of absolute finality that covers every human endeavor. And in that release, the weight of my lifelong cynicism lifted, leaving behind a terrifying, exhilarating lightness. The miracle in Bethany, precisely because of its public, shocking nature, became the defining point for all those involved, both for belief and for destruction. For us, the eyewitnesses, it forged an unshakable certainty. For the religious authorities, it was the final, intolerable provocation. News traveled fast, carried by the frightened Jerusalem mourners, leading immediately to the convening of the High Council, the Sanhedrin. Lazarus, who was merely enjoying his second chance at life, had become a political weapon, a living embodiment of the challenge Jesus posed to established power. I heard the reports filtering back through the marketplace. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. The cynical, cold-blooded pragmatism of Caiaphas, the high priest, was the final confirmation of how deeply the resurrection had shaken the foundations of power. It is better for one man to die for the people than that the whole nation perish. In their despair over losing control, they chose murder. They were willing to sacrifice the innocent to maintain their grip on a system that the presence of Lazarus rendered obsolete. This realization was staggering. The very act that cured my despair became the death sentence for the man who performed it. But even this grim irony could not extinguish the light Lazarus represented. His continued presence was a silent, unmoving sermon on the ultimate triumph over despair. Whenever I felt the familiar shadows of doubt creep in, the worry about the future, the fear of losing another loved one, the anxiety over the rising political storm, I simply had to look at Lazarus. His continued, ordinary breathing was the answer. If the God who commanded him out of the grave can conquer death, surely he can conquer a shortage of grain, or a Roman decree, or the temporary setbacks that plague our lives. This profound connection between ancient miracle and modern feeling is what compels me even now. We often feel, for days gone, our job is irrevocably lost, our relationship is irreparably broken, our health is irreversibly damaged. We believe that decay has set in, that the stone is too heavy, the stench too strong. But the parable of Lazarus is the living proof that no human situation, no matter how absolute its finality seems, lies outside the jurisdiction of divine intervention. The cure for despair is not the absence of trouble, but the absolute certainty that even in the deepest, most final darkness, the voice can still penetrate and command us forth. It changes everything. It means that failure is temporary, and hope is not a fragile wish, but a radical reality waiting to be enacted. Lazarus, the man who died, taught me how to truly live without fear of the end, seeing every hardship as merely a prelude to a greater demonstration of life's unyielding power to return and renew. I left Bethany a stonemason, but I returned to my craft a witness to the profound truth that the rocks themselves will move when commanded by the Master of Life, shattering all despair in the process and ushering in an era where the only fear is the fear of not fully accepting the glorious, impossible reality that death itself has been made a liar.